This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better.
I'm David Blaney. From high-tech washing machines to digital voice assistants such as Alexa, Siri and Cortana, robots have become integral parts of many of our daily lives. But while these technologies have proven useful, their increasing intelligence has led to concerns of robots taking our jobs or even robot uprisings. To explore the future of this topic further, with me today is Dr Eleanor Sandry, an expert in human-robot communication at Curtin University. Thank you very much for coming in today, Eleanor.
Hi there, I'm pleased to be here.
How are robots changing what it means to be human?
Well, robots and, to be honest, technologies in general are often regarded by people as actually being intrinsically part of being human, in fact, because human life has always been associated closely with the use of technology, the creation of technology, etc. If we're thinking about robots and the kind of newer technologies, artificial intelligence technologies, what we're beginning to see now is a continuation of what's a really long history of technologies and machines becoming something that humans are concerned to separate themselves from. It's like to identify their humanity as against a robot. And yet, of course, many people are intrinsically cyborgs already. So I, for example, cannot operate without my contact lenses or my glasses. I'm basically completely blind otherwise. So I would consider myself already in some ways cyborg. And those are possibilities that people now discuss much more and more about futures of technologies and robotic prosthetics, but all sorts of other things. I mean, even from your basic pacemaker, which can of course be hacked because it's an intelligent machine, in fact. And then from the opposite side, you have robots coming towards humans. Broadly, robots are not normally organic in any way, but people do experiments with small pieces of muscle fiber, for example, to actually power robots and power certain technologies. And so they're beginning to kind of come closer together. So really, it's not that robots have changed much about how we think of ourselves as humans directly. It's kind of, we've always been very closely associated with technology, but I guess that they're raising a lot of questions for people now around what they can do and what maybe humans are still the only ones capable of doing those things. So ideas around creativity, the ideas of emotion, empathy, all of these things are now kind of coming up as part of people's designs for robots and for autonomous technologies and AI more generally.
Do we have a healthy relationship with robots? We hear a lot about robots making decisions about us. So, a robot let me into this building. Over the weekend, I bought a ticket for something and a robot asked me to prove that I wasn't a robot. Robots replacing us in the workplace. How's our relationship faring with robots?
Well, we do hear a lot about the potential for robots and AI and algorithms and machine learning systems to do harm to humans. And there is no doubt that there are good examples where they have done harm to humans, whether that's broad sections of society or a particular person. But in fact, I think it's really important to remember it's not just our relationship with robots themselves, with the machines that are in question. It's also our relationship with the people who develop those machines and the people who then go on to use them. And so quite often the problems actually arise, they're not really down to the machine in itself. It's kind of doing the best it can. But the way that a developer has chosen to program it, the data set upon which it's been trained, say, if it's a machine learning program, and of course the way it's implemented. If it's implemented without human oversight, then it's very easy for things to go wrong. Robots and automated technologies more generally don't actually fare that well in complex physical real-world environments. They're very good within kind of constrained spaces where things are under control, but put them out into the real world and then there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong, and sometimes it's quite difficult, even though you'll see reports in the news where someone will say, oh, they should have thought that this might happen or they should have taken more care with this, but in fact it can be surprisingly difficult to plan ahead. So it's really easy for these technologies, if they're misused, effectively, I would say they're being misused, if they're just being put out there on their own, then the chances of them harming someone are quite high.
And what are some of the most egregious misuses of robots that we see today?
Well, I mean, we have the use of relatively simple systems, actually in this country, of course, to try to collect people's debts. And
Those robo-debts.
Absolutely, and I saw it on the news today about them taking down part of the robo-debt system. That has clearly introduced something that's a very rule-based system into an environment where really you actually need to make human decisions. And the programmed machine is unable to make those decisions at a sufficient granularity. In the States, probably one of the biggest examples that people talk about is the way that they're using robots to deal with sentencing. And in particular looking at recidivism, so the chances that someone is going to reoffend. And they're noticing, of course, completely unsurprisingly, that the robots are racist, but the robots are just, their bias is based on the data sets upon which they have been trained, and all they are doing is bringing to light the fact that, in fact, the whole judicial system is racist.
So it was us who were racist the whole time?
We were racist first. Then you get your robot to be racist on your behalf. Mm-hmm. And probably to actually become more racist, in fact, because they're very rule-based. Mm-hmm. So that's just how it works.
So the word robot, tell us about the origin of the word robot. It's a Czech word, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So the word robot itself comes from the Czech robota. Robota was a term that a playwright, Karel Čapek, well, he was looking for a term for the players in one of his plays, who were going to seem to be, rather staid, non-emotional workers, okay? And his brother, in fact, Joseph Čapek, came up with the term robota. And so Rossum's universal robots were born. Those robots, of course, are interesting because they were organic. They weren't actually machines like most of the vast majority of our robots now. And really the whole story of the play is based around the fact that robota means or is linked with ideas of forced labour. So the positioning of these entities as slaves. And that is something that is still part of conversations around robots now. Should robots effectively be slaves to humanity? And there are lots of questions that raises around what's going to happen if someone starts treating a machine as a slave. How will that impact on their relationships with other beings, in particular other humans? If that robot looks human-like, will that have more of an effect? There's all sorts of questions to be asked around that. And for me, more broadly, there's questions around whether it's actually worth trying to build intelligent machines. So you're then going to subjugate in that way and effectively just use them as tools, when maybe what you should be doing is trying to work out ways of collaborating with them so you're actually capitalizing on all of that intelligence that you've put into the machine and combining it with human intelligence to do things much better and faster.
The notion of robots, I guess, becoming so smart that they decide to overthrow humanity and kill all of us, it's a very sort of pervasive trope in pop culture since, well, forever. What does that say about us? Do we feel guilty, for example, or what does that tell us about us?
I think it mostly tells us that humans have a deep desire to be in control of everything all the time, actually, and that they are afraid of things that they don't fully understand. And to be honest, I think that with new technologies, it is worth being afraid of things that you don't understand. And there's a lot of requests now that these new technologies become transparent so that people understand how they are making the decisions that they're making, rather than them making a decision and then someone going, well, I don't know why I did that, but clearly it must be right because it's been programmed, and that they have this fallback position that the machine, because it's being logical, must be being correct. And that is often not the case. So it's also worth recognizing, I suppose, that a lot of these popular cultural stories come from the US, Europe. Čapek's story is actually ends up with the robots uprising and killing all the humans. And if you look at other cultures, I mean, the big example always is Japan. Then they have a totally different attitude towards their robots. They're much more see their robots as friends. And so there's a completely different kind of cultural attitude and cultural set of stories. But yeah, if you look on a website like Wired or Gizmodo, they're reporting something about a robot, then the chances are you're going to see a whole bunch of comments about this is the sign of the robot uprising.
It's always Skynet, Terminator.
Almost, yeah, all these references come out.
Why is that? Why is it that some places have a much more positive sort of positive relationship with robots in terms of how they see them?
I think it may show the importance of popular cultural stories and those historical stories. So if you're in Europe, the US, you've got the stories that maybe probably start with IUR, but even before that, you've got the golem in the Jewish myths, and the fact that golems can run riot as well. But if you get to IUR, then you've got Metropolis. There's a long history of things before you even get to Terminator, which are talking about machines taking over and basically getting rid of humans. And if you look at stories elsewhere, for instance, within Japan, the most cited one is going to be Astro Boy. Basically a hero story, where the robot is a hero and a friend. And also you have embedded within some people's religious beliefs, the ideas of animism and the fact that even a completely inanimate toy, for example, actually has a soul. And so there's a completely different kind of myth and story set that kind of sits behind these assumptions over what's happening with technology, particularly robots.
Robots are getting, I think it's fair to say that robots are getting pretty smart. When should we start being concerned, or should we even be concerned?
Well, I think probably the first thing to do is to question that initial statement. Like, robots may seem to be getting smart, but they're not really that smart. Most people don't see what's happening currently in robotics or artificial intelligence as actually being that smart in any kind of generalizable terms. So they're often very good at doing something within a narrow kind of set of rules or a narrow space of engagement. But if you try to take them outside that, they're still really not smart enough to deal with the world, in fact. So I would say that currently there's no need to worry about the robot uprising. I don't think they're going to take over the world. I think that what we do need to be worried about is the people who are designing and developing these machines, the people who are then implementing them without human oversight and without taking care over the sorts of decisions that they're making that are affecting people's lives. And though that's really where the concerns need to be. And also more recent, I've been reading increasingly, and I'm actually quite worried about this, the drive for newer and newer technology all the time is actually a part of our environmental crisis. These technologies almost always require large amounts of power to exist and run. And also, of course, they draw on precious minerals as well. And so you've got dangerous mining conditions, and you've also just got those taking of the minerals out of the earth as well, which is just causing all sorts of concerns for people. So they're much broader concerns than just being worried about the robot uprising or robots becoming too intelligent and kind of taking over. I think those are the least important of the concerns.
Do you think we maybe overestimate robots' intelligence? We think that it's because, a computer decided, so it must be right?
I think there is a tendency to do that, particularly where a system has been implemented by one set of people and is then being used by another. They've been told probably how good that computer system is, and they're very prepared to accept it.
It's made by science people.
They're very prepared to accept it as taking responsibility for something when really maybe they should be questioning it more easily. I think there are lots of reasons though why people fall into that, making those kind of mistakes. A lot of it is to do with the way that the media, the technology media, but now increasingly the mainstream media report these types of technologies. The way that things are portrayed, often they look like they're really operational. And that goes for things like Atlas, the Atlas robot, the humanoid robot from Boston Dynamics, but also into things like Google Duplex, all of these things. You see them operating at their very best. And people will write about them as if they are always operating at that kind of level. But in fact, there's actually going to be all sorts of underlying issues with them. Whenever I go and see a robot in a lab, I can pretty much guarantee it won't be working when I arrive.
Because it's everything stage managed.
Often it is. So some things in particular, there was quite a lot of fuss around Sophia, a robot face, very expressive face that seemingly talked intelligently in interviews. A lot of fuss around this. It was given a form of citizenship within one of the Arab states, within Saudi Arabia. Yep, that's right. And it's not as intelligent as it seems. It's a program system. It's programmed with speeches. Yes, it has an amazingly expressive face, but it is not as intelligent as what it says would seem to suggest.
Why is there this sort of space where a robot face becomes a little bit too real and it becomes a little uncomfortable? Whereas if you've got sort of just a basic sort of geometric sort of shape of maybe like, okay, here's a circle and a couple of little black dots. Why does that look, why are we able to maybe connect with that more and see that as being more human than sort of some creepy humanoid face?
The jury is actually out a bit around this. The most popular theory which people will draw upon is Masahiro Mori's Uncanny Valley, which was originally actually about still objects that become increasingly human-like, and the fact that they will suddenly become corpse-like. Okay, and then what happened was that theory was then taken into moving robotics and animatronics, and it does seem, I mean, from my experience talking to people as well, and people who have those very realistic human-like heads sitting next to them on the desk, you know, they do feel a bit creeped out by them and they don't like them. And usually the problem is that they look very human-like until they start moving. Then there are certain little things that give them away. Okay, so they're quite clearly not actually human. And even if you look at some of the very best of these types of robots, you will still be able to pick that it's a robot, I would almost guarantee. In general, I think that robots which rely on our ability to anthropomorphize even the simplest of shapes movement are actually more successful. Maybe they don't even need to have a face at all. Maybe it could be more about the way that they move. Maybe if they do have a face, they have a simpler face. Probably the kind of space in which you see people using those sorts of faces most at the moment are actually to do with medical environments where they're helping particularly kids on the autism spectrum to kind of get a bit more easy around interacting with people, in particular looking at faces, which is a problem for some people. Not for everyone, but for some people on that spectrum, they find that difficult. And so a robot with a simple face that is completely non-judgmental, not too expressive, is something that actually they're going to find it easier to interact with. But I think actually there's lots of potential for those sorts of faces just for everyone. My research really is about questioning why we need to make robots look like us at all.
And why do we?
Well, most
Not
people,
to spoil your research.
most people say that they want to create human-like robots that behave or communicate in human-like ways to make them easier for us to communicate with. But actually, this falls into a couple of different traps, I would suggest. One is that it's very difficult to make robots that are really human-like, as we've just been discussing. Also, it means that people then are interacting with it thinking it's going to be human-like, when in fact it's probably going to fall short of that. And they may well become disappointed and cease to interact with the robot. There are tremendous possibilities for interacting with robots that are not human-like at all, that are actually shaped like household objects. This has been shown in various experiments and research. And the other problem, I think, is that people are now very focused on creating interfaces that kind of operate in what I might describe as an ideal human-like way. So these voice assistants, for example, very much based around people being able to communicate with a voice. So having a voice, not everyone does, some people are nonverbal, and they still need to be able to use technology. So if you start focusing only on creating voice interfaces for people who have very clear intonation and probably also a US accent, then, or at least up front until things get developed a lot further down the line, then effectively you're actually removing that technology from the people who might need it the most. So I think there are lots of issues around creating human-like interfaces, but the reason that people do it up front is because they think it's going to be easier, where easier goes in inverted commas and kind of isn't necessarily easier.
And also because it just looks cool. There's nothing cooler than going out to a press conference or tech conference and someone saying, okay, Alexa, schedule an appointment, and then Alexa just does it, even though it's not really, it's just following a flow chart, really. It's not really...
Yeah, well, I mean, that was Google Duplex. They were very proud of Duplex because of the way that...
A duplex, that's the one that pretends to be a human when you're calling a restaurant.
Well, originally it did. They're now, they backtracked on that a bit because people were so upset that people might be trying to communicate very politely with Duplex when really they should be aware that they were communicating with a machine.
Because it would do things like pretending to and ah, for example.
Well, it didn't pretend to and ah, it did and ah in the right sorts of places. But whether or not you really want a robot to be able to do that, simply to make it easier or more natural, where, you know, natural also goes in inverted commas because not every person does that either. You know, this idea of just wanting to make it seem human-like to that extent is questionable. You know, like, do you really want your machine to communicate that way, or would you like it to just be more direct, more straightforward, and maybe more precise? So, you know, I mean, it's a kind of a trick, which is, you're right, it's very, very good when you're showing something to a press conference. That's what they decided.
What does the future of our relationship with robots look like?
Well, I'm concerned that the future of our relationship with robots and with other intelligent machines may not be as interesting as it could be, unless we actually do start changing the way that we think about designing and developing these machines. I would say that the ideal future, from my perspective, is adopting a much stronger acceptance of the fact that humans collaborating with machines is a really good way forward. It's a good way forward in terms of workspaces, because it involves using both the skills and abilities of a machine and the human together to complete tasks. We already see it to a certain extent in factories, but often the drive is to remove humans from those environments to save money, for example, whereas in fact looking at humans and machines working together will almost certainly provide more interesting solutions. I think that looking, you know, for full autonomy always is probably increasingly going to be or people are going to become more aware of the environmental concerns around that. And also, I think just the human concerns around that, where really we want to have human oversight over decision-making systems, or over robots that are killer robots of war even, for example, where we actually want to have distributed systems of control where humans and machines are actually working together. That, I think, would be a good future. It's not necessarily the future that we're heading towards.
What needs
Sorry,
to change?
Is that too hard? I am actually really
what needs to change for us to be heading towards the better future, as opposed to the crappy one that we're hurtling towards now?
Well, I think that there's a big drive currently to involve ethical thinking and ethics more generally in technology, design of technology, and also implementation of technology. I think that is a key thing. There's now quite a lot of really useful, actually positive, practical work in that area. So the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, has a special working party that has produced something called Ethically Aligned Design, which is a really good document that has brought together lots of different people's opinions around the world on technologies and how they should be developed in the future to be more ethical. I think that we are a bit trapped currently by kind of commerce and economics in the large countries in particular, and the fact that mostly this is about making money and not actually about making lives better. So it's always worth looking at these companies, and when you see them saying that they're developing AI for good or robotics for good or whatever, that actually question what they are actually involved in doing, because it could well be to do with making money rather than actually making people's lives better. I think that, you know, getting more people involved on the ground, getting communities involved in understanding how these technologies work and whether or not they want, like, do they want self-driving cars on their roads? If they are going to come onto the roads, how are they going to come onto the roads? How are they going to be introduced? There's often a lot of practical problems and questions that aren't really raised early enough in these sorts of developments. So I think that, you know, definitely positive ways ahead, but a lot of it does involve really embedding ethical thinking within this type of technology and within these types of technology companies, and also probably now increasingly within government as well, because I don't think many of us rely on our governments to protect us from these sorts of things at the moment.
Is it possible for robots to become self-aware? Is that even, forget about whether it will happen or won't happen, is it even possible for that to?
I have no idea. I actually don't think that, I certainly don't have the scientific or neurological chops to answer that question. I think that it's also very difficult to even understand the differences between the awareness of different organic beings anyway. And there are also questions then around the awareness of different people when they're in various situations, and how you tell when someone's aware when they can't. You know, we often assume that someone who's non-verbal may be not aware, or someone who is paralyzed, you know, and in fact we're wrong. So there are lots of issues around identifying what it means to be aware. I mean, really, robots already are. They sense their environment, or most, you know, the sorts of robots that I write about sense their environment and respond to it. They have behaviors. And in many ways, they are already aware. That's what allows them to do what they do at all. But when you say aware, of course, you're meaning much more
sort of self-aware,
fully conscious, self-aware. You're moving into all of those ideas around sentience. Those questions are very difficult to answer. I don't think it's coming anytime soon. And I also think that we should probably consider the fact, as a lot of science fiction does, that robots will be aware and self-aware in very different ways from us, because they don't have the same sorts of bodies as us. They don't have the same sorts of neurological systems. They don't have the same sorts of chemicals rushing around their bodies that cause us to have feelings. You know, the question of whether or not robots really have emotions or feelings is not really out as far as I'm concerned. They don't, not in any kind of human-like way. And yet they may have behaviours that seem to indicate that they have feelings or emotions. So you see, it's a very difficult question to answer.
Well, it's similar to how if I had my phone out here and I was to say something rude to the voice assistant on it, it would react to it. But of course, that's just a pre-programmed response.
It is, and interestingly, voice assistants have their different ways of dealing with those situations. Siri is a bit more sassy, for example, than Alexa. Interesting.
What is a sassy question I could ask Google?
I wouldn't try risking it right now, because you don't want to work with robots, children, or animals, in my experience.
Well, let's have it a shot. What's your favourite colour?
I like simultaneously thinking about every colour at once, but mostly I love Google's colours.
Someone got paid a lot of money to come up with that answer.
And you'll find that there are different answers as well, so you won't always get the same one. That's part of trying to build into these programs, this kind of unpredictability, which is something that some roboticists and technologists write about as being important, to keeping people's interest in engaging with the machine. But again, it's questionable over how much time and money should be spent on that kind of.
Why do robots fixate and fascinate us so much?
I think because humans have always been fascinated by building things that seem to be intelligent, or writing about people building things that seem to be intelligent. That in some texts, that's kind of regarded as a sort of a God complex. There have been people who've noted that some of the early technologists at MIT and in other places, for example, really felt that their creation of robots was something like the creation of a new species. I suspect that underlies some of it. I think people like being clever, and they like creating things that seem clever.
One final question before we finish up. What's your favourite robot text or movie or book? Your favourite fictional robot?
Right, so I have to start with books first, because that's really where I came into this research area from. And my favourite books are Ian M. Banks's culture novels. Banks writes about a utopian future in which humans and machines coexist in a shared society. And although, in fact, the machines are basically in control all the time, they're hyper-intelligent, there are written into those texts both robots in the form of drones and also humans that are valued by the machines that run that society for their very humanity, often for their intuitive thinking, for their abilities to be flexible in certain situations. So I just find those texts really interesting. But that's really where I started. I read Banks's stories and I was like, this is the sort of relationship that I'm interested in between humans and machines that are definitely not human-like. In fact, they are quite startlingly different in the way that they think and speak and act. And so I was fascinated by that, in contrast with the sorts of human-like machines that I was far less attracted to. In terms of popular text, a bit more up to date at least, I would say that my favourite film is still actually Interstellar, which I know is a few years old now, but because, again, robots in Interstellar are not human-like. And I just love the idea of having a robot that you can dial up and dial down things like humour and sarcasm and honesty. The whole idea of being able to tailor a robot to kind of suit your personality, but being very different from you as well, is really interesting. I like the fact that you could tailor them for different situations. I just think it breaks down that idea of, it's still a control idea, and yet, of course, those robots were tremendously powerful, could go into spaces that humans could not, such as a black hole. So it raises a lot of really interesting questions. So I reckon those are my favourite texts at the moment.
Well, a little bit less sophisticated. I was going to go for probably Baymax from Big Hero 6 and Wally from Wally.
Yes, I think that's probably why I'm a bit different from some other people, because I tend to be looking for these oddities rather than looking for the cute. I'm not so interested in cute robots. I'm much more interested in robots that maybe challenge us to think differently, that we can collaborate with and actually do things really interesting ways.
Well, goodness me, Eleanor, thank you very much for coming in and sharing your knowledge on this topic.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's been great. I've enjoyed answering these questions.
And thank you for listening. You've been listening to The Future of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you have any questions about today's topic, please feel free to get in touch or follow the links in the show notes. Bye for now.